January 1st, 1930, 6:09 a.m., Harlem. A man who'd been feeding the police for 9 years opened his door to a sealed letter. Stephanie St. Clair's handwriting on the front. No threats. Just facts he didn't know she'd been collecting. January 1st, 1930, 6:09 a.m., Harlem. The morning came in thin and cold, the kind that made the brownstones look carved from ash. Street lamps were still on, refusing to admit the night was finished. Somewhere down the block, a delivery wagon rattled over uneven stone. Somewhere closer, a radio leaked a faint hymn through a window that hadn't fully shut. He opened his eyes before the city fully opened its. Not from virtue, habit. 9 years of borrowed cover had taught him that dawn was when men made mistakes. Dawn was when cops knocked. Dawn was when a neighbor noticed who came and went. Dawn was when you could still pretend to be a respectable man on his way to honest work. He lived in a rooming house off Lenox, a narrow place with a stairwell that held every footstep like gossip. He'd chosen it because it never felt like home. A home gave you roots. Roots gave people something to pull. He dressed in silence. Shirt. Coat. The same motions, every morning, like a prayer he didn't believe in but performed anyway. Then he heard it, soft, almost nothing. The scrape of paper against stone. He froze with one hand on the doorknob. Not fear exactly. Calculation. The kind that made your chest tight but your face stay still. No knock. No voice. Just that quiet contact, like someone placing a thought where it couldn't be unseen. He opened the door an inch, then another. The hallway was empty. No footsteps retreating. No breath caught around the corner. Just a rectangular envelope on the stoop, clean, sealed, deliberate. He stepped down and picked it up with 2 fingers like it might leave something on his skin. The handwriting stopped him. Not because it was sloppy. Because it wasn't. The letters were controlled, formal, certain. The kind of hand that didn't ask permission to be read. And in the top left corner, a name that Harlem didn't whisper, it acknowledged. Madame Stephanie St. Clair. He looked up the street and down it like the street might confess. Nothing moved except a man far away dragging a broom across the sidewalk, slow and patient as time. The informant swallowed once, then brought the envelope inside and locked the door with a care that felt like superstition. He sat at the small table by the window where weak winter light turned the room gray. He placed the envelope on the wood and stared at it as if the paper could speak without being opened. Because it already had. For 9 years, he believed the same comfortable lie, that Harlem's numbers people were too busy counting money to count men like him. That a black woman banker, no matter how wealthy, could be pushed, raided, embarrassed, because the city would always treat her like temporary power. He'd lived off that lie. He'd sold routes for it. Drop points. Names. Small truths, just enough to keep his police contact pleased, just enough to keep his own hands clean in public. And now, on the first morning of the new year, Stephanie St. Clair had put her handwriting on his doorstep like a verdict, calm, elegant, and impossible to ignore. He broke the seal. Inside was one sheet of paper. No decoration. No flourish. No perfume. Just ink and intention. He read the first line and his throat tightened. Not because it threatened him. Because it knew him. His real name, one he hadn't used in Harlem in years. An address he'd once lived at, long before he learned the value of disappearing. A date he'd tried to forget. The afternoon he'd walked a runner's schedule into a precinct house and watched a raid unfold like theater. His eyes moved down the page. There were no insults. No profanity. Not even the satisfaction of cruelty. Just facts, arranged in a sequence that made their meaning unavoidable. A badge number. A meeting place. The time. A phrase that his handler used, apparently without realizing words could be collected the way money was collected, quietly, patiently, and with receipts. The informant felt heat rise in his face, a sudden shame so sharp it turned into anger. Not at her. At himself. Because anger was easier than admitting what he'd just realized. Stephanie St. Clair hadn't found him this morning. She'd been tracking him for years. He read the final lines twice. Slower the second time as if speed could change the meaning. Still no threat. Still no plea. Only a sentence that landed like a locked door. You have survived because you believed I did not keep records. He stared at the paper until the words blurred, then he looked out the window as if the street would tell him what to do next. Outside, Harlem was waking up. A woman in a church hat passed with her collar up against the cold. 2 boys argued softly near the corner. A man with a lunch pail walked like the day already owed him something. Normal life. That was the terrifying part. Because if Stephanie could place a letter this cleanly, without noise, without witnesses, without a single obvious footprint, then her reach wasn't the kind men carried in their fists. It was the kind carried in a neighborhood's memory. Stephanie St. Clair was known for using paper as a weapon. Public letters, paid statements, the Amsterdam News as a stage when courts and police refused to listen. She didn't hide her fight, she documented it. The informant folded the letter once. Then again. Precise creases. The way you handle something that can ruin you if it ends up in the wrong hands, which meant, in Harlem, almost any hands at all. His mind started running options like a man counting his last dollars. Run. He could run. Confess. He could try. Bargain. He could offer someone else. And then he realized the cruelest part of Stephanie's strategy. Those were the same 3 options he'd been selling other people for 9 years. He stood and went to the small mirror by the door, adjusting his tie until his hands stopped shaking. He looked like an ordinary man again. That was always his disguise. But as he reached for his coat, his eyes flicked once, just once, back to the folded paper on the table. Because he understood now, the letter wasn't the beginning. It was the moment Stephanie decided the accounting was due. And whatever he did next, Harlem would know before nightfall, because Stephanie St. Clair didn't just run numbers. She ran records. She ran reputations. She ran time. January 1st, 1930. 7:02 a.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. While the informant sat in his rented room staring at a page that knew his whole life, Stephanie St. Clair was already at her desk, coat on, pearls set clean at her throat, the apartment quiet in the particular way expensive buildings are quiet. The radiator ticked like a clock. The city outside hummed low, held behind thick walls and good plaster. On the leather blotter in front of her, 2 ledgers. The first was the business, columns of numbers, runners' names, routes, payout schedules. The spine of Harlem's unofficial economy, kept steady while banks denied loans and employers denied wages. In the 1920s, the numbers game had grown into Harlem's biggest black business. Millions of dollars moving through nickels and dimes, through hands instead of institutions. The second ledger was smaller. Thinner. Not meant for accountants. It wasn't money. It was people. Names. Faces. Relationships. Patterns. A book of the city's hidden wiring. Stephanie wrote 1 line in the small ledger and underlined it once, hard enough to leave a bruise in the paper. Then she closed it and placed it back in the drawer, as if it were nothing more dangerous than a handkerchief. Because the most important part of her surveillance system was not secrecy. It was discipline. She had learned that long before Harlem called her Queenie, back when New York first tried to reduce her to a line on a form. Lower Manhattan. A cold gray morning, salt in the air, and too many languages forced into 1 line. Stephanie stepped off a ship with $200 sewn into her coat and a face that didn't ask for mercy. At Ellis Island, men in uniforms looked at immigrants the way landlords look at tenants, like every breath needed approval. A clerk read her name as if it were an inconvenience. He tried to smooth it down. Stephanie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That is my name," she said, calm, certain, the faint Martinique cadence still present even when she chose her English carefully. The clerk wrote it correctly and Stephanie never forgot the lesson. Power doesn't always punch. Sometimes it edits. Harlem became her answer. By the late 1910s and into the 1920s, Harlem was building itself into a capital. Culture and migration, jazz and church, rent strikes and ambition. It was also building an economy the city refused to legitimize. The numbers game, illegal on paper, essential in practice, spread through kitchens, barbershops, beauty parlors, and storefronts. Stephanie watched it the way some people watch a sermon, not for entertainment but for structure. By 1923 she had saved $10,000, a sum so large for a black immigrant domestic worker that polite New York would have called it impossible if it hadn't been real. She didn't buy territory with it. She built systems. And systems require 2 things, accuracy and eyes. Her operation grew, 40 blocks then more. By the late 1920s she was clearing sums the press struggled to name without turning her into a caricature. Contemporary reporting placed her income in the range of $200,000 a year and her fortune around $500,000 in cash, staggering money for a black woman in that era, and a reason powerful men watched her like a fire they wanted to control. But the money was never the thing that made her dangerous. It was how she organized the neighborhood to see what she saw. Stephanie's informant network didn't look like a spy ring from the movies. No trench coats. No whispered rendezvous under bridges. It looked like Harlem. A shoeshine man who noticed which shoes were new and which ones belonged. A fruit vendor who noticed when an unfamiliar car lingered too long at the curb. A church usher who noticed which men stopped coming to service after a raid. A doorman who could tell by the way a visitor held his hat, whether he came with respect or with entitlement. Stephanie built her surveillance system the same way she built her numbers bank, through employment and loyalty. She paid people on time. She protected them when pressure came. She made it clear, without speeches, that her operation didn't just take bets. It carried Harlem's weight. So Harlem carried hers. Her runners were trained to do more than collect slips. They were trained to remember. Not everything. Just the right things. A license plate that started with 2 letters. A scar above a man's right eyebrow. A badge number flashed too quickly as if the officer wanted deniability. A knock at a door that came 3 seconds too early, meaning the police already knew who lived there. In Stephanie's organization, a good runner didn't gossip. A good runner delivered facts. In her back office, the accounting ran like a bank. Slips sorted, totals checked, ledgers balanced. But on the edges of those ledgers, in margins no outsider would care about, were small marks, tiny notations that meant something only to her and her controllers. Because she didn't just track money. She tracked pressure. If a runner said, 2 men asked questions on 7th Avenue, Stephanie didn't ask, did they threaten you? She asked, did they speak to you or at you? Because the tone told her what kind of man she was dealing with. And once she knew the kind of man, she knew the kind of mistake he'd eventually make. Stephanie also kept her network compartmentalized, quietly, naturally. No one person knew everything. A runner knew his route. A comptroller knew the day's totals. A courier knew the destination, not the contents. A church contact knew which families were hurting, not why. This wasn't paranoia. It was engineering. It meant a betrayal could bruise her operation, but it couldn't break its spine. And betrayals did come, especially once the police realized they could profit from protecting an illegal economy they also wanted to control. Stephanie understood NYPD corruption the way she understood arithmetic, as a system with inputs and outputs. A raid wasn't just a raid. It was a transaction. December 30th, 1929. 117 West 141st Street. When officers arrested her for possession of numbers slips, the city expected the usual script. A black woman humbled in court, quiet in the papers, grateful for whatever punishment was reduced. Stephanie refused that script. On January 1, 1930, she placed a paid statement in the New York Amsterdam News, public, deliberate, turning her arrest into a spotlight aimed back at the men who thought they could frame her in silence. This is what set her apart from most operators, male or female. She didn't just fight in alleys. She fought in print. She understood that violence could be dismissed as gangster business, something the city could shrug off as normal for Harlem. But documentation? Names? Dates? Payments? That made respectable men sweat. It made institutions react. And it gave Harlem something it rarely got, a record that couldn't be talked away. Stephanie used the Amsterdam News not as propaganda but as pressure. She was known to take out ads and write open letters, sometimes warning enemies, sometimes instructing her neighbors on how to handle police harassment, sometimes making clear that she would publish names when crossed. And she didn't reserve that tactic only for gangsters. She used it on the state. December 1930. The Seabury Commission hearings, investigating corruption in the courts and the NYPD. Stephanie arrived dressed like a woman who understood theater better than the men who wrote the script. Mink coat. Chic hat. The kind of elegance that forced officials to look at her as a person, not a problem. She testified that she had paid police, money moving through the system like a toll, and that testimony helped trigger disciplinary action against officers. That's the part most people miss when they talk about her informant network. Stephanie didn't just have informants. She made the police inform on themselves. Because she treated corruption like a ledger. Every payment, every favor, every understanding was a line item, something that could be recalled when needed. Her surveillance system had 3 layers, each one stronger than the last. First, street-level observation, Harlem's daily eyes. Second, operational verification, her controllers cross-checking routes, timing, and disruptions like auditors. Third, institutional leverage, the press, the courts, commissions, and public record. Most criminals live only in the first layer. Stephanie lived in all 3. That's why a man could survive as an informant for 9 years and still be doomed by a single piece of paper. Because Stephanie's system didn't need luck. It needed time. And it needed her favorite discipline, waiting until the facts were heavy enough to drop. At 4:09 Edgecombe, the morning light finally began to climb into the room. Stephanie lifted the business ledger again, ran her finger down a column of names and paused on one entry, not the informant's name but a runner's. A person with a family. A person who had been put at risk by someone who thought Harlem was too busy to notice betrayal. Stephanie's expression didn't change. But her eyes sharpened the way they always did when emotion threatened to blur the work. She picked up her pen. Not to threaten anyone. To finish the accounting. Because that's what her surveillance really was. Not spying for sport, not paranoia for its own sake. It was protection, executed with the calm precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being underestimated, and learned to turn that underestimation into data. January 1, 1930. 9:28 a.m. Harlem. The informant left his rooming house the way he always did, shoulders squared, hat set right, face blank enough to pass as honest. That was the trick. If you looked like a man with nothing to hide, the neighborhood stopped looking. But the letter in his coat pocket changed the weight of the air. He could feel it each time the paper pressed against his ribs when he walked. Not because it was threatening. Because it was specific. A name. A badge number. A time. A place. And that one line that stripped him clean without raising its voice. You have survived because you believed I did not keep records. He moved south toward a familiar corner, the kind men chose when they didn't want to be seen entering a precinct like they belonged there. A storefront with a half-open shutter. A coffee counter that sold cheap cups to expensive habits. A place where you could stand still and pretend you were waiting for a streetcar. His handler arrived late on purpose. Always late, because punctuality looked like partnership. The handler was plain clothes. White. Early 40s. A man who believed his authority extended past his badge because in Harlem, it often did. He didn't greet the informant by name. He greeted him like property. You got something? The handler asked, voice low, irritated as if information was owed, not earned. The informant's mouth was dry. He kept his eyes forward. Never looked too eager, never looked too afraid. I got a problem, he said. The handler's jaw tightened. Your problems aren't my department. Your information is. The informant didn't answer that. He reached into his coat and brought out the folded page, not the original envelope, not the seal, nothing that could be traced back if the handler panicked. Just the sheet itself, creased clean. The handler took it and read the first line. Then the second. His face changed in small increments, tightening near the eyes, a pause at the corner of his mouth. The kind of shift a man makes when he realizes he's been standing on a floor he didn't build. Where'd you get this? The handler asked, though his voice already knew the answer. The informant didn't give him the satisfaction of a confession. It came to my door, he said. Dawn. The handler read again, slower. Now he wasn't reading words. He was reading consequences. This is nothing, the handler said finally, too quickly, too loud for a man who wanted the lie to hold. She's bluffing. The informant held still. 9 years of running had taught him the difference between bluff and file. She's not, he said. She's not bluffing. That line about the badge number, only you and me know that. The handler's fingers tightened on the paper. He looked past the informant, scanning the street as if the neighborhood itself might be listening. It was. A shoeshine man 2 storefronts away was watching. Not staring. Watching. Calm. Patient. Like he had all day to remember faces. The handler lowered his voice. You did your job. You brought us what we needed. And what about what she needs? The informant asked and hated himself for how desperate it sounded. The handler snapped his eyes back. You watch your mouth. The informant's hands stayed at his sides, but his mind was already sprinting. The letter wasn't just about him. It was about the handler. The precinct. The whole little economy of raids and protection that fed itself off Harlem's vulnerability. The handler folded the paper and shoved it into his coat as if hiding it could change what it contained. Go home, he said. Keep your head down. Don't talk to anybody. I'll handle it. The informant swallowed. Handle it how? The handler's expression went flat, official again. I said I'll handle it. That was how you knew a man had no plan. He repeated the line like it was a door he could close. The informant walked away without arguing because arguing was for men who believed they had choices. He had something else now, proof that Stephanie St. Clair had been watching the watchers. And if she had sent this letter on January 1st, it meant she had chosen the date on purpose. New Year's Day. A day when the city wanted clean headlines and ceremonial speeches. A day when the police department liked to pretend it had control. Stephanie was about to test that control in public. January 1st, 1930. 11:42 a.m. Police Headquarters, Center Street, Manhattan. Up here, Harlem always arrived as paperwork. Reports. Arrest logs. Complaints that were filed, ignored, filed again. The noise of a neighborhood translated into ink that didn't capture the human cost. The commissioner's office smelled like cigars and furniture polish. Authority layered over anxiety. The commissioner himself, white, well-fed, careful, sat behind a heavy desk that had seen every kind of crisis except the kind that came from a black woman who refused to be quiet. A deputy stepped in with a folded newspaper. Not the Times. Not the Herald Tribune. The New York Amsterdam News. The deputy placed it on the desk like it was evidence. The commissioner didn't touch it at first. He stared at the masthead as if the paper had no right to exist in his office. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. The deputy's voice stayed professional. "Paid statement. From St. Clair." The commissioner finally opened the paper. He read. His face didn't show outrage. Outrage was too theatrical. Outrage suggested surprise. What showed instead was something more dangerous. A controlled kind of fear. The fear of a man who understood how institutions fall apart. Because Stephanie St. Clair wasn't writing gossip. She was writing record. She was known to use public letters and paid statements to push back against police harassment and corruption, turning her own arrests into public pressure. The commissioner read a line, then read it again slower, the way a man rereads a threat he can't prosecute. He looked up. Who approved her arrest? The deputy hesitated. That hesitation was an answer. Which precinct? The commissioner asked. The deputy cleared his throat. She was picked up at a numbers location, West 141st Street. The commissioner's fingers tapped once on the desk, a small rhythm of irritation. She's accusing officers, the commissioner said, voice controlled. In print. Yes, sir. The commissioner leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a beat as if it held solutions. Down in Harlem, arrests were easy. Raids were easy. Humiliations were easy. But this was harder. Because a raid disappears into the noise. A printed statement becomes a document. And documents travel, to clergy, to attorneys, to commission hearings, to judges who care more about embarrassment than justice. The deputy spoke carefully. Do we respond? The commissioner's mouth tightened. Respond how? He asked. With another raid? Another spectacle? And then she takes out another statement naming names. He flipped the paper again, scanning like he was looking for a place to cut. But every line was written like it had already been checked. That was Stephanie's style. She didn't throw punches she couldn't defend. The commissioner pushed the newspaper across his desk as if it burned his fingertips. I want her watched, he said. The deputy nodded, relieved to have an order. Then the commissioner added, colder, quietly, because he understood the trap. If he watched her loudly, Harlem would watch back. If he touched her too hard, she'd turn it into ink. And if she had what she claimed to have, names, payments, patterns, then the department wasn't dealing with a criminal problem. It was dealing with a credibility problem. The deputy tried to steady the air. It's just one woman. The commissioner looked at him, finally, directly. No, he said. It's a woman who knows how to write. Silence sat in the room. Then the commissioner spoke again, softer, helpless in a way authority rarely admits. She's making us answer her, he said. In public. And that was the helplessness. Not that she might win a street fight. That she might win a record. January 1st, 1930. 3:16 p.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. Stephanie sat at her desk as if none of this was dramatic, because for her, it wasn't. It was procedure. A ledger to the left. A stack of slips to the right. A clean cup of tea cooling near her hand. She didn't need to imagine the commissioner's reaction. She could predict it. Men like him didn't fear criminals. They feared documentation that made them look incompetent. She opened her smaller ledger, the one with people, patterns, and betrayals, and made a new note beneath the line she'd underlined that morning. Not a threat. An update. Because the informant's 9 years had always been borrowed time. And Stephanie St. Clair had decided the loan was due. January 1st, 1930. 4:08 p.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. The city had spent the morning pretending it could still control the narrative. By late afternoon, the narrative was already walking around Harlem, folded under arms, passed across counters, read twice in barbershops the way men reread a contract when they suspect the fine print is about to cost them. Stephanie St. Clair didn't celebrate. She didn't pace. She didn't call anyone to gloat. She sat at her desk with the calm of a woman who understood that pressure, real pressure, was not a punch. It was a sequence. A timed arrangement of small, undeniable facts. On her desk, the business ledger lay open. Routes, collections, names, the invisible labor that kept Harlem's numbers economy moving when banks refused to serve black communities. The numbers game had become massive in Harlem by the late 1920s, with bankers like Stephanie at the center of a system built on trust and payout discipline. Beside that ledger was the file Harlem never saw. Not because it didn't exist. Because Stephanie never needed to show it until it could do the most work with the least noise. Dorothy Sims stood near the doorway, coat buttoned, eyes steady but tired. Winston Pace sat in a chair that made him look younger than he was, like the chair had stripped his bravado and left only responsibility. Outside, the city's winter lights softened. Inside, Stephanie's desk lamp made a clean circle of authority. Dorothy spoke first, careful with her voice, like loudness might invite danger back into the room. "The paper's moving," she said. "Men at the stand on Lenox. They're reading it like scripture." Stephanie's pen didn't pause. "Good." Winston swallowed. "And the one who's been talking." Stephanie looked up just once. Not angry. Not surprised. Unmoved. "He is not the one," she said. "He is one of many. But today he is the one who will learn what records do to a man who believes women don't keep them." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin notebook, the kind that looked harmless until you realized it could ruin careers. Dorothy watched the notebook the way people watch a gun, with respect and a little fear. "Madam," Dorothy said quietly, "are we sure the commissioner will act?" Stephanie's mouth barely moved. "The commissioner won't act because he respects me. He'll act because he respects embarrassment." Stephanie had spent years learning what moved institutions. She knew the city could absorb violence like rainwater, run off into gutters, forgotten by morning. But printed accusations, paid statements, public letters, those lived longer than bruises. Stephanie was known for using the press to address her enemies and the police, sometimes in open letters and paid advertisements that forced officials to answer in public. She turned a page in her notebook. "Tonight," she said, "Harlem will do what Harlem does best." Dorothy frowned. "And what is that?" Stephanie's eyes lifted again, steady, almost gentle. "Remember. January 1st, 1930. 5:22 p.m. Lenox Avenue and 125th Street. If you wanted to feel the neighborhood's pulse, you didn't go to the precinct. You went to a newsstand. A stack of the New York Amsterdam News sat on the counter like freshly printed dynamite, quiet, legal, devastating. Men in work coats leaned in, hats low, reading with the particular focus Harlem reserved for anything that had consequences. A barber stepped out from his shop, apron still on, to catch the headline in the first paragraphs. A woman with a grocery bag paused long enough to read 2 lines, then kept walking, mouth set in a hard, thoughtful way. People didn't cheer. Harlem didn't cheer for survival. It simply adjusted. A man said softly, "She put it in print." Another answered, "That's worse than a bullet." And a third, older, voice rough with experience, said, "Now they got to answer her in public." The story traveled in 2 languages, ink and oral repetition. Someone summarized it in a beauty parlor. Someone repeated it in a stairwell. Someone brought it into a church vestibule like a rumor with legal standing. And with each repetition the same name landed heavier. Madame St. Clair. In Harlem, Madame didn't mean softness. It meant structure. January 1st, 1930. 6:10 p.m. A back room above a storefront near West 141st Street. The informant had avoided this room for months. Too many eyes. Too many people who knew how to notice the wrong kind of nervousness. But the letter in his pocket had changed the mathematics. He needed allies. Or protection. Or a place to vanish. He found a man he recognized, one of the smaller operators, a man who had always stayed polite with Stephanie's people and careful with his own. The informant tried to sound casual. "Evening," he said. The man looked at him once. Then looked away. Not rude. Final. The informant's throat tightened. "I need a word." The man's voice came out low, controlled. "You need a priest." The informant forced a smile. "That's funny." The man finally turned his head fully. His eyes were tired, not angry. Tired like someone who'd watched too many men sell the neighborhood and still asked to be welcomed back in. "You think you've been running?" the man said quietly. "But you've been borrowing." The informant felt heat rise in his face. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man nodded toward the street below, where footsteps moved in steady Harlem rhythm. "Everybody knows what you are," he said. "They just didn't know if she knew. Now we know she knew." The informant tried again, desperation slipping into his tone like a crack in glass. I didn't mean. You meant the money, the man cut in. And you meant staying alive. He leaned in just enough to be heard. Best thing you can do, he said, is stop making your fear everybody else's problem. The informant stood there, humiliated by the calm. Then he turned and left. And as he walked down the stairs, he realized the worst part wasn't police. It wasn't Stephanie. It was Harlem's quiet decision to stop pretending it didn't see him. January 2, 1930. 7:38 a.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue. Stephanie didn't sleep late. Power didn't allow late. She was already at her desk when Robert Ellis arrived with a small envelope of updates, verbal notes written down in careful shorthand, passed through hands that knew better than to be dramatic. Robert stood straight, eyes forward. Madam. He tried to reach people last night. Stephanie nodded once. And? Robert's mouth tightened. Doors didn't open. That was Harlem's first response. Refusal. Not violence. Refusal. Stephanie opened her business ledger and made a mark beside 3 routes. Small adjustments that looked like accounting but were actually security. Dorothy watched her pen move. Are we moving drop points? Not yet, Stephanie said. If you move too early, you teach him where to look. Today we teach him where he cannot go. She reached for the telephone and dialed a number she didn't write down anywhere. A man answered with a cautious voice, one of those precinct contacts who didn't love Stephanie but feared being wrong about her. Yeah. Stephanie didn't waste time. There will be a man today trying to trade his guilt for protection. He will call himself useful. Pause. Who is this? Stephanie's tone stayed calm. You know who. Another pause, longer. Then, where? Stephanie gave a location, not as an order, as an inevitability. Then she added, soft but precise, do not touch him like an animal. Touch him like a document. She hung up before the man could regain control of the conversation. Dorothy exhaled slowly. You're having him picked up. I'm having him stopped, Stephanie corrected. Arrest is paperwork. Paperwork is what he fears. January 2, 1930. 1:26 p.m. Near 135th Street, Harlem. The informant moved like he had a destination, but his eyes betrayed him. Flicking too often, checking corners, reading faces the way a guilty man reads a jury. He wasn't running yet. He was trying to bargain with time. A dark car eased to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, controlled, not theatrical. Plain movements. Official movements. Sir, one officer said, voice neutral. We need a word. The informant's body stiffened. His mouth opened, then closed. He tried to put confidence back into his shoulders, like confidence could erase a paper trail. I haven't done anything, he said. One officer glanced at the other, then back. That's not what we're discussing. The informant's eyes darted, up the block, down it, looking for witnesses. Harlem had already provided them. A shoeshine man watched with his chin lifted. A woman with a grocery bag slowed and then didn't slow, kept walking at the same pace, like she refused to give him the dignity of spectacle. The officer spoke again, measured. Hands where I can see them. This was not a beating. This was not a raid. This was not the brutality Harlem had come to expect when a black man got stopped by white authority. This was worse for him. This was procedure. They turned him toward the car. One officer produced handcuffs, not slammed, not snapped for show, just applied with the clinical certainty of a door being locked. The informant tried one last move. You don't understand, there are people. The officer cut him off quietly. Yes, we understand. And that was the moment the informant realized. He wasn't being arrested because of a sudden discovery. He was being arrested because someone had arranged the timing. Someone had decided he would be a public fact. January 2, 1930. 2:11 p.m. Harlem. The news traveled fast not because the police announced it, but because Harlem observed it. He got picked up, a man said in a barbershop doorway. They got him in cuffs, someone answered at the newsstand. Who set that up? A young runner asked, eyes wide. An older woman in a church hat replied without looking up from her bag. Who you think? No one said Stephanie's name loudly. They didn't need to. Saying it loudly would cheapen it. They spoke it the way you speak the name of an institution. Like the church. Like the paper. Like a law you couldn't argue with. January 2, 1930. 4:03 p.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue. Dorothy returned with her coat still on, cheeks cold from the street. Winston followed, face tight, trying to process what relief felt like when it arrived without applause. They took him, Winston said. Stephanie was seated, writing. She didn't look up. Where? She asked. Dorothy answered. Center Street likely. Or Holding First. Stephanie nodded once, a small motion that held no joy, only completion. Winston finally let frustration slip into his voice. Madam, all these years he'd been selling us. And that's it? Just paperwork? Stephanie looked up then, eyes steady. That is never just paperwork, she said. Paper is what makes men like him believe they're safe. Paper is what makes men like him believe they can harm others and remain unnamed. She placed her pen down carefully, like she was setting a rule on the table. And paper, she continued, is what makes the commissioner helpless. Dorothy's voice was soft. What happens now? Stephanie's expression didn't change, but the room did. It tightened around her certainty. Now, she said, Harlem remembers what it saw, and the city remembers what it read. She reached into the drawer and touched the thin notebook, the file she never showed. Not as a threat. As a reminder. Because the informant's arrest wasn't the end of her strategy. It was proof that her surveillance system worked the way she built everything else. Quietly, accurately, and with the neighborhood's dignity intact. And outside her window, Harlem kept moving. Streetcars, footsteps, storefronts, the economy of survival continuing without interruption. Which was always the point. Stephanie St. Clair did not win by destroying Harlem's rhythm. She won by protecting it, while making sure the people who betrayed it finally had to live inside the record they thought they controlled. January 3, 1930. 5:18 a.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. The city was still dark enough to pretend it could hide its own habits. Stephanie St. Clair didn't believe in that kind of darkness. She sat at her desk with her coat already on, pearls laid clean at her throat like punctuation, gloves beside a cup of coffee that would cool before she touched it. The apartment held its quiet, thick walls, careful neighbors, the kind of building where important people lived and tried to appear untouched by Harlem's street-level realities. The kind of building where, if a woman like Stephanie lived there, it meant she had done something the city's rules did not intend to permit. On the desk, a single sheet of paper typed this time. Neat. Cold. Official looking without being official. Dorothy Sims watched from the doorway, hat in hand, as if she had walked into a room where the air itself was expensive. Winston Pace sat closer than usual, hands folded, trying to understand how a neighborhood breathed again after holding its breath. Robert Ellis, young, disciplined, stood by the window with an envelope tucked under his arm, waiting for the moment Stephanie decided time should move. Dorothy spoke softly. They say he's in holding. Stephanie didn't look up. Of course he is. Winston's voice carried the anger he'd been trying to swallow for years. And his handler? Stephanie's pen paused. Not because she was unsure. Because she chose to acknowledge the question. His handler is alive, she said. Which means he is still useful to someone. So we make him useless. Dorothy frowned. How? Stephanie finally raised her eyes. Calm. Direct. The kind of calm that made people feel their own nervousness too loudly. We put him in the light, she said. And we do it in a way that makes the commissioner feel watched. It wasn't a metaphor. It was her entire method. Stephanie had already used print to force the city to answer her before. Paid statements, open letters, public challenges that turned private harassment into a record. That was how she survived in a system that relied on black silence to keep its own hands clean. She slid the typed sheet toward Robert. Take this to the Amsterdam News office, she said. Hand it directly to the editor. Robert didn't ask what it was. He never did. He nodded once. Yes, madam. And then, she added almost gently, wait for my call. Robert left, and the door shut with a soft final sound. Winston leaned forward. What did you just send? Stephanie's answer came like arithmetic. Instructions. Dorothy blinked. To who? To Harlem, Stephanie said. And to the men who keep thinking Harlem is just a place where things happen to people. She opened her smaller ledger, thin, unremarkable, and ran a finger down one page where names sat like seeds. Handlers, patrolmen, local fixers, men who liked their power quiet and their profits quieter. Then she closed it again. Today, she said, we don't chase anyone. Dorothy's voice dropped. Then what do we do? Stephanie stood, smoothing her coat as if preparing for church. We let them come to us, she said. And when they do, we don't threaten. We document. January 3, 1930. 7:37 a.m. Lenox Avenue and 125th Street. The city woke the way it always did. Vendors lifting shutters, streetcars grinding, men stepping around each other with the practiced politeness of a neighborhood that couldn't afford public chaos. But there was something new on the block. A slightly tighter silence, like Harlem had decided to listen for footsteps it used to ignore. At the newsstand the Amsterdam News lay stacked and ready, ink still sharp, paper still stiff. Men gathered in a half-circle that looked casual from a distance but wasn't. A barber stood at the edge, apron on, eyes scanning the page. A woman with a grocery bag paused long enough to read the first paragraph, then kept walking with her jaw set. Someone said, "She wrote again." Someone else answered, "She always writes." That was the new reality Stephanie had been building for years, Harlem treating her words like infrastructure. Not gossip. Not drama. A tool. Her paid statement didn't scream. It didn't beg. It did something more dangerous. It taught what to do when police search without a warrant. What to write down, badge numbers, names, times. How to make a complaint become a record instead of a bruise. Stephanie's public letters and statements often served exactly that purpose, turning her own conflict with police into advice for her neighbors, a form of community defense built out of paper. A young man, one of the smaller runners, read a line twice and looked up, eyes wider than he meant them to be. "Madam's telling people to write down badge numbers," he said under his breath. An older man near the edge of the crowd, work coat, tired face, answered quietly, "That's not advice. That's a warning." And the warning wasn't to Harlem. It was to the commissioner. Because Harlem's new reality wasn't just about safety. It was about visibility. When enough people start recording the same kind of abuse, the institution cannot pretend it is isolated. January 3, 1930. 10:06 a.m. Center Street, Manhattan. The commissioner's office was quiet in the way the rich prefer their crises. Behind closed doors, behind polished wood, behind men who spoke softly so they could pretend they were still in control. A deputy placed two things on the commissioner's desk. First, the Amsterdam News. Second, a folder, thin, tidy, sealed with the kind of restraint that felt like insult. The commissioner stared at the folder longer than he stared at the paper. Because the folder looked like evidence, and he understood evidence was the one currency his office couldn't dismiss without paying for it later. "What is this?" he asked. The deputy's voice stayed even. "Delivered by courier. No return address. Marked, for the commissioner." The commissioner didn't open it right away. He flipped through the Amsterdam News first, because public embarrassment always arrived faster than private damage. He read Stephanie's statement with a tightening face. Not anger. Calculation. Because the city could raid Harlem and still sleep at night. But it couldn't be seen losing control of Harlem's narrative. Then he opened the folder. Inside were copies, cleanly arranged. A timeline. A list of raids and disruptions that matched precinct logs too closely to be coincidence. A set of notes that looked like they'd been cross-checked by someone who understood procedure. And one page, set apart, containing what the commissioner recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind of document. A pattern. He looked up at the deputy. "Who compiled this?" The deputy hesitated. That hesitation was an answer. The commissioner exhaled through his nose. "A woman." He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. He had heard it too many times in too many contexts. A banker, a public nuisance, a problem, a headline maker, a black woman who refused to play small. He pushed the folder back as if it might infect his desk. "She wants me to clean my own house," he said. The deputy tried to keep his voice neutral. "She's forcing questions, sir." The commissioner stared at the paper again, the calm, instructional tone, the refusal to plead. "She isn't forcing questions," he said. "She's forcing answers." And for the first time the commissioner sounded almost tired. Helpless in a way men like him never admitted aloud. "If I ignore her," he said, "she prints more. If I retaliate she prints that too. And if she has half the documentation she claims." He stopped. Because finishing that sentence meant admitting what he feared. That his department's control of Harlem was not law. It was theater. And she had learned how to rewrite the script. Stephanie St. Clair's willingness to use newspaper space, paid statements and open letters, to confront officials is precisely why so much of her story exists in print at all. She made sure the city couldn't erase her quietly. The commissioner finally spoke, each word chosen like a reluctant concession. "Bring me the arrest log," he said. "And bring me the name of the officer who's been meeting informants off Lenox." The deputy's eyes flickered, surprised the commissioner would go that far. "Yes, sir." The commissioner added, colder, "No more street theater. If we act quietly." Even in surrender he wanted control of tone. But he was already too late. Harlem had read the paper. And Harlem didn't need the commissioner's permission to remember. January 3, 1930. 6:22 p.m. 409 Edgecombe Avenue, Sugar Hill. Stephanie sat at her desk again as twilight fell, the city turning to silhouette outside her window. Dorothy returned with an update, verbal as always. Harlem didn't trust paper for everything. Stephanie didn't ask it to. Dorothy's voice was controlled, but the relief in it slipped through. They're nervous downtown. Stephanie's expression didn't change. Good. Winston asked the question that had been sitting in him all day. Madam, was that the move? Stephanie looked at him for a long moment, long enough to make him feel the weight of the years he'd worked routes for her, long enough to make him understand the lesson wasn't about one informant. It's one move, she said. The final move is what Harlem does next. Dorothy frowned. And what is Harlem going to do? Stephanie's answer came quiet, almost tender, because it was the part she protected most. Harlem is going to keep living, she said. But now it will live with its eyes open. She reached for her small ledger, touched its cover once and slid it back into the drawer. No celebration. No speeches. No victory lap. Just a new reality. Informants would think twice because they knew Queenie kept records. Police would move more carefully because they knew she could make their names public. Runners would walk a little straighter because they knew someone powerful was watching for them, not just watching them. And the commissioner, sitting behind polished wood, would spend his nights wondering how a black Caribbean woman in Harlem had managed to do what his whole department couldn't. Make the city feel observed. January 6, 1930. 8:03 a.m. Harlem didn't feel victorious. It felt normal again. That was the real tell. A newsboy's call cut through the winter air. A streetcar complained against the rails like it always had. On Lenox Avenue, shutters rose, slow metal teeth revealing fruit stands and barber chairs and counters where people paid in coins because coins were honest. Harlem had no interest in celebrating survival. Harlem simply resumed it. And somewhere between 125th and Sugar Hill, men who had once enjoyed walking too close to other people's lives began walking a little farther from the curb. Not because the police had found religion. Because paper had found them. Stephanie St. Clair watched the neighborhood return to rhythm the way a banker watches a vault door close, quietly with no need to touch it. She understood something the commissioner didn't. When power is real, it doesn't need to announce itself. It only needs to keep the lights on. At 409 Edgecombe Avenue, her day moved with the discipline she'd built into everything. The ledger opened. Names checked. Routes adjusted with a pencil mark so small it looked like accounting, not security. Dorothy Sims brought word from the street. Winston Pace reported his corridor. Robert Ellis waited for instructions that never sounded like panic, only sequence. Winston asked, low, like he didn't want the walls to repeat it back to him, Madam, will they try again? Stephanie didn't answer right away. She let the silence do its work. Then she said, they will try someone. That is their habit. But they will remember this week the next time they think Harlem is blind. She wasn't describing courage. She was describing deterrence, the kind built by documentation and community memory, not gunfire. And that was the long-term change Stephanie forced into Harlem's air. People began to record what they used to endure. Not every person. Not every day. But enough. Badge numbers. Times. Names. Faces. The small facts that made harassment become a pattern instead of an accident. That shift didn't come from a sermon. It came from a woman who understood that the city could ignore pain, but it couldn't ignore embarrassment with receipts. Stephanie was known for using the press, paid statements, open letters, public warnings, to put her enemies and the police into the record. The commissioner's helplessness, the thing he couldn't say out loud, was simple. Stephanie's power didn't live only in the numbers racket. It lived in how she made institutions behave. A raid could be shrugged off as cleaning up crime. But when a Harlem woman placed her words into the Amsterdam News, when she named the shape of corruption and taught her neighbors how to respond, she turned the NYPD's favorite weapon, silence, into a liability. And she didn't stop at newspapers. In December 1930, Stephanie appeared before the Seabury Commission, the investigation into corruption in the NYPD and the courts, lavishly dressed, unashamed, testifying about the money that moved between police and policy. It's the kind of scene the city hates. A woman had tried to criminalize walking into a formal inquiry like she belonged there, making officers and magistrates sound like the underworld. That's why her legacy isn't just crime history. It's power history, how a Caribbean immigrant woman learned to operate inside a city that didn't intend to grant her legitimacy, and then forced that city to acknowledge her anyway. She lived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, a building associated with Harlem's black elite, and she was remembered breezing through the lobby in fur, visible, mythic, impossible to reduce to a whisper. And when bigger predators arrived, men like Dutch Schultz who saw Harlem's numbers as a prize, Stephanie's response stayed consistent. Information, alliances, press pressure, and the refusal to surrender her community economy to outsiders who treated Harlem like territory instead of people. The fight over Harlem's policy game became so consequential that historians still cite her as one of the fiercest opponents Schultz faced. Even the men history later crowned as Harlem's bosses passed through her system first. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson became an associate and enforcer for numbers Queen Madame Stephanie St. Clair, rising in a world she already ran. So what did Stephanie leave behind after the informant's door received that letter? After Harlem watched a man's protection evaporate without a single shot fired? She left behind a new reality that outlasts any one arrest. A neighborhood that understood, deeply, practically, that survival isn't only about toughness. It's about organization. It's about who keeps notes. It's about who can turn a city's own procedures into a trap. And in Harlem, the people who mattered most didn't need statues to remember her. They remembered in quieter ways: an envelope that arrived when rent was late, a runner paid on time, a doorman who said "Madam" like it was law, a newspaper folded open on a barbershop counter like a shield. That's Stephanie St. Clair's legacy: strategic, immigrant, female, black, and prepared. Not loud. Not fragile. Just inevitable.